I'm going to just do the preliminary sketch for this scene of a lovely old house in Campagnac. I'm just drawing the basic shapes of the lawn and the wall and the house, which comes just over halfway. Let's get a vertical in to help us. And we start getting the proportions as soon as we divide it up. And it's all about planning at this stage, trying to capture the close-up perspective. So we've got some steep angles on the gutter line here and here. And I know my artists often find it difficult to get those angles right, but one of the best ways to do it is just to literally hold out a pencil in front of you, looking at your house, looking at your building, look at the angle and just transcribe that angle, move it from your subject and then draw it as you see it. And the more practice you get, the more you could develop the eye for perspective. So to carry on the shape of the house, we can't see the far wall. It's hidden by another bit of broken window here, which I'll come to. But when we do a roof on a house, the first thing you need to do is work out where the roof is going to, where it's coming from. So I'm going to find the top of the roof here, the top of the hip. It's a hipped roof. And I'm looking at where this point lines up with the house. So if I visualize it's coming along the gutter, just a bit to here, and then I go up, and that's my point. So I've worked out how far along the gutter that point goes, and then I can connect it up. And then it's a simple process of just connecting that point with the gutter over here. So you get this triangle. You can check it, look at that angle and make sure you're getting the angle right, but work out where that point is and how high it is. And in fact, in drawing any buildings, the simplest thing is always to get a vertical or two in, but you can then gauge the proportions by comparing the height of the roof with the height of the wall, the height of the chimney with the height of the wall. And if you always come back to that proportion, you'll get everything else right. The far end of the ridge we can't see, it's behind the chimney, but we can pretty much approximate where it is, and again draw the angle at the back of the roof. So when I put the chimney on, it will pass through that. So there's 3 lines for a chimney. The middle line is the nearest part of the chimney to you. And the reason I state that is that will then determine the shape of the top of the chimney. And again, common mistake in drawing buildings is to make the chimney wonky and draw the angles wrong. So if the middle line is the nearest part of the chimney to you, it will be the tallest line. So,
Christopher, can I ask you a question?
yes, please ask questions.
What blue did you use other than the cerulean blue?
So I've got ultramarine and cerulean blue ready to go for painting the sky and helping with all the greens. So I'm just adding my chimney pots up here. And again, if you're looking up at a chimney pot, the middle of the chimney pot is higher than the edges of the chimney pot, so the curve goes up. These chimney pots have actually got little hoods on them. Whether you put them on or not is up to you. There's a dormer window over here, and again, dormer windows can be tricky. Just one little tip, by the way, I need the dormer window in the middle of the wall, or in the middle of this side of the house. And when you want to find the middle of the side of the house, what you do is you draw diagonals from corner to corner, and that will locate the middle of the wall. And so now when I line up my windows, actually the dormer is set slightly back, so it's not quite in line with that line, but the windows beneath are central to that line, and the door beneath is also centered on that line. And when you draw the angles of the window ledges and the tops of the doors, all of those angles are going to be related to an imaginary vanishing point. In this instance, the right wall has a right vanishing point. You don't actually need to plot it, but you need to know roughly where it is so you can aim in that direction, and then you can get all these angles radiating out from this vanishing point on the right. And then there'll be a vanishing point over to the left, which will also help you when you're painting the individual stones if you're going to do that. or the tiles, because the tiles all go back to a vanishing point on the left. So we've got the rough shape of the house in place. We'll put the trees and the other features in front of that in due course. I'm just going to plan a bit more of the composition here with the lovely old rickety bit of fencing here, which goes from the edge of the door and across. And it's literally made out of old chestnut stakes, I should guess. And when I was looking at it as I took the photograph, I noticed this lovely old fence, which has got lichen growing all over it, has actually got some new shiny bolts in it, which I was very pleased to see, because that means that the owner of the property, rather than throw away this old rickety bit of fence and put something horrible and new in, has decided to conserve this ancient bit of history. So it adds an attractive feature to the subject. So we've got the fence. I'm not going to, I'm just indicating roughly where these things go. When I paint it, I'll place the individual parts of the fence more accurately. And there's a gate post over here, and a fence and a tree. And we can just indicate roughly where they go. The other thing we need to know is where there's an orchard through here, and the top of the orchard is you can see just above the fence. And there are trees which are just in spring, or in the early April. They're just starting to produce blossoms, so we can work with those in a minute. So on this side, we want to get the ruin of an old building next to the house. Here's a vertical to help us, and there's an opening in this building, which I presume is a tall window, all in beautiful mellow stone, sandstone, limestone from the region, typical of the Périgord region for stonework here in France. And that makes a nice feature to the left of the house, and then we've got some hedging and shrubbery over here, and I'm just again indicating it. I don't have to draw it in any detail. I'm just really pulling out the shapes with the charcoal pencil to indicate where they all are. And I'm not going to draw the bare branches of these trees yet, because we need to paint the sky and then put that on top. We've got what look like a whole load of irises about to come into flower down here, all the leaves of irises, I think. Well, there could be some tulips there, I don't know. So, and again, there are details in things like windows, shutters, etc., which I shall add. The only thing I'm going to do now is just add a bit of roof to the top of the dormer window. And you don't really see any detail in these windows because of the angle we're at, so they can be painted very simply. Slope of the chimney down the roof here, I didn't quite get in where it meets the roof. Right, we're ready for paint. So I've laid out a simple palette of burnt umber and white, and then we've got two blues, ultramarine and cerulean blue, a warm and a cold blue. We've got two yellows, a yellow ochre and a cadmium yellow. And you've got a bit of cadmium orange and to warm up the walls, and I've also got a little bit of cadmium red for when it comes to the tiles on the roof. Other colours will work as well. And then for the green, I've got some sap green just to help with the different greens. Again, you don't necessarily have to have a green. But to paint a sky, it's got a sort of soft bit of cloud. There's no particular compositional value in the sky I'm looking at. So what I'm going to do is paint that sky, but create a little bit more space between the clouds. So I'm going to start by painting a uniform sky, and then I'll add clouds to it. So I'm mixing my blues, a little bit of both blues, the ultramarine and the cerulean, to make quite a strong blue. I'm just adding white to get it to the right strength. And again, you can always hold up a palette knife like this and just compare. I'm going to also mix a slightly warmer blue with a bit more ultramarine. So I'm going to have a bit of variety in the blues. They'll get cooler as they go down the painting. Now you can mix other colours into your blues if you want to grey them, but I'm just going to use them because I've got a warm ground which was created just with a wipe over of raw sienna. And I think I'll put a tiny bit of orange into that ground as well. I just sponged that over, being acrylics I'm using, I've just wiped it over with acrylic paint. But you can do the same for an oil painting. You can wipe your canvas over with acrylic paint if it's not a canvas designed purely for oils. You'll know because they should say on the canvas that they're acrylic primed. Then if you colour them like this, you'll get a nice warm ground colour, which is the traditional way to get some depth into your painting. Now I'm just using a soft brush now, a synthetic brush, with the warmer shade of blue, which I'm going to place at the top. I'm not worried too much about getting the colour covering every part of the panel, because what we can do is use the gaps for our clouds, so a soft bit of cloud to capture the soft lighting. It's a mistake to try and change the lighting too much from a source photograph like this, because if you change the sky, you'll have to change everything else in the painting. The colours of the walls, the colours of the grass, etc. So when you're using a photograph as a source like this, you really must stick with what you've got if you want to make it work. So I'm just following the shape of the roof with the edge of the brush, going up to the chimney pots. You do pick up a little bit of charcoal on the brush when you do this. Don't worry about that, because you're going to be putting a couple of layers on, and by the time you get to the second layer of paint, you'll find that the charcoal won't mix into it at all. So I've just mixed a slightly paler and cooler shade of blue now, which is the first mix I made actually on the panel, with a bit more white in it. So as I come down the painting, the sky cools down a little bit, which is the sort of typical thing you can expect. Don't worry if it looks too harsh a contrast, because I just get some cool blue in lower down, and then I'm going to come back and do a sort of mix of the two together. So we've got the edge of the roof coming down here, just picking out that shape. And wherever you see sky coming through the trees, paint some sky. Doesn't matter if you paint more sky than you can see, because we put the trees back on top. If you're painting quickly like this, you'll notice I'm not diluting the paint right down with water. I'm using it pretty much as it comes out of the tube. All I'll do is dampen my brush. I won't actually put water and mix it with my paint to make it flow. I prefer just to use thicker paint and more paint to make it flow. So don't be mean with your paint. So there we are. I'm taking some of the warmer blue up now, and I'm slightly overlapping the warm blue and the cold blue in here to overlap and mix rather than physically mix. So here I come in again, the paint's starting to dry already here, and the second time I come up to that chimney stack, the colour comes out more cleanly because the charcoal's already been diluted. You'll also notice I'm moving the brush in every direction. I'm not just going uniformly. If I wanted to paint a flat, totally flat sky, I would probably just do smooth horizontal strokes. So now we're going to mix in some of the clouds, and I'm just going to add white to my palest blue, and I'm also going to add a tiny bit of yellow ochre, and that produces a grey actually. It might look white compared to the blue, but when you see white going on the picture later, that's a bit too yellow, that bit, you'll see it's not really white, it's just a very pale grey blue. So So I'm just bringing that up over the top, and at this stage I don't press at all with the brush. I'm just flicking the colour loosely into the paint, which is still sticky. Just flicking it, overlapping the colours I've already placed. And in some areas you can see the colours showing through, and in other areas not. And it's just a naturalistic look I'm aiming for, with very light pressure. So just to give this sort of wispy cloud look. If you have problems blending the colours or getting the right effect because you've got too much colour on the brush, a simple trick is just to pick up a second clean brush, which I can do and show you. Here's a clean brush. I'm actually going to moisten it very slightly, just with a bit of water. And with a clean brush, no colour on it, you can then just control how much you want the colours to merge. So with this, you notice I can get a very smooth effect between the clouds and the blues. You have to work quickly while the paint's still sticky enough, but you can smooth out your brush strokes with a second clean brush. I'm actually going to come back with some cloud colour there anyway. So just touch it in, and you can always come back and add more colour, more cloud, more blue, especially if you've mixed plenty at the beginning, if you want to enhance the effect. I'm going to just check I've got enough colour now to, in the sky, going right down into the trees here, and I think so we're ready to move down the painting. I'm going to paint the landscape and then come back to the house. So the next stage is to pick up another brush, and this time I'm using a filbert brush which has got a rounded end to it. I've got a couple of them now, and these brushes are really good for doing foliage. So I'm just mixing cadmium yellow into the sky blue I had, and that will give me some very bright greens. So I'm just going to place some bright greens. There is a rule, well, it's a rule for everything, but you could ignore it if you like. There's one rule which says always paint the darks and add the lights. Well, that's a rule for acrylics and or oils, but to start with, when you're just placing colours, it's really just to establish the range of colours you're going to do. Now, I'm not going to have lots and lots of this light green, but I just want to put some in here, so as I paint the surrounding greens, bits of it will remain, bits of it will be hidden. But it just starts to place the green. So I'll take the other brush and I'll mix some darker greens. And this time I'm mixing into the darker blues I had on the palette with some of the sap green and yellow ochre. And we'll place some greens down here and here. And this is just a base layer. I will be adding to these layers later on. So it's just to start placing all the different parts of the painting. Get that clamped into place. So that's just an indication. I'm going to come down here with the grass below, and so, and now I'm mixing up the grass colours are very vibrant. I'm adding in some cerulean blue to my cadmium yellow, and then I get a really strong green. But what we've got down here is some lovely, lush, long grass with masses of daisies and wild flowers growing in it. So I'm just going to give it a thin there, and I'm going to build up some texture. That might be something I come back to even at the end of the picture, but I'm just going to suggest a bit of that. And again, it doesn't matter if some of this ground colour shows through, because if you look at your source, you'll see between all the lush greens, you'll see yellower patches of grass. You'll see lots of different colours in here, so you can add some little lighter patches here and there. And I'm just almost stippling the colour on here, and because a brush is a brush and it's made out of individual hairs, if you use that and just literally press the brush onto the grass, it will create the shape of grass. You can go from a light shade to a darker shade. You can add a little bit more of your either the blues to create some shadows like this, and just literally stippling, pressing, flicking. Just experiment with your brush. Use the side of the brush, use the tip of the brush, use the whole width of the brush. But what I'm doing is I'm not really pressing very hard. I'm just stippling and flicking and placing different greens side by side to create a little bit of texture as I go. And again, I will come back and build more layers as the painting progresses. I can do the same in the shrubs to the left. There's some very strong darks, so let's get those in. If you want to get darks into your trees and bushes, I've got burnt umber, and I'm adding burnt umber and ultramarine to my green over here, and then we get a very nice dark green, so we can put some patches of dark in here. I can go even darker than this actually. If you look at trees with the sun above, often the shadows seem almost black, so the more blue and brown you add to your green, the blacker it will go. At the end of the orchard here, for example, to the right of the house, the trees are and the hedge are very dark. So if you're painting dark greens, add a dark brown and a blue. Burnt umber and ultramarine are perfect. If you haven't got ultramarine, you need to buy it. It's so versatile. And the trees on the right are dark. And what I'm going to do with these as I start to build up the greens is I'll do some of this flicking, where if you haven't got too much paint on the brush, you can just flick it over the edge of the sky. Literally put the brush onto the canvas and just slightly move it sideways, and you'll get these little broken patches of colour. It's called scumbling, but you can create the illusion of all the different tree shapes if you practice your scumbling. So scumbling can sometimes just be a little light flick of a brush. Other times you can press harder and flick upwards or flick sideways. And experiment again, because the more paint you put on, the more solid your flicks come, like here. The less paint, the lighter the flicks will be. And so you can suggest lots of foliage with very, very little effort. And then the trees over here go quite dark. There are some blossoms I'll add on there later. If you're a watercolourist, you'll have to have preserved your pale paper to get that, to get your blossoms, but an acrylic or an oil artist, that's not an issue. So some more darks over to the left, and there's some more darks in the ivy that's growing up on the ruined wall in front of the house. What I do need to do where the fencing here is to get the colour of the lawn or the orchard. I think lawn is a little bit too grand a term for it, but to get the orchard green through the gate. So I'm mixing up a middle green now using cadmium yellow and a little bit of sap to paint the grass through here. So I'm painting over my drawing. That's why I didn't really bother to paint the fencing too carefully, because I just wanted to get the right proportions, because I will put that back in with paint in a minute. I'm going to just put the grass through there. And what I'm also trying to do with a subject like this, so I'm still using a 1-inch wide brush to paint with. What I'm also trying to do is create a sense of depth through from the foreground here as you go back. And again, looking at the source, you'll see that there are some paler patches in the lawn. The same down here, just in front of the gate. So I added a little bit of yellow. Sometimes I add a little bit of yellow and a little bit of white to depending on how bright. So some paler patches where the sun is just catching some areas through here. So just on the tip of the brush with a really light bit of yellow, I'm just flicking that in and brushing sideways to suggest where the sunlight's catching the back of the orchard, and it hopefully will just take your eye past the house and through past the fencing and into the orchard beyond. And again, this sort of colouring is all about getting traditional effect of what's called counter change, light on dark, dark on light. And if you see these effects naturally, exploit them, and you can create a painting which is always going to sort of resonate from solid to ethereal, from things you see through like the trees, and then other areas where the light catches a surface and creates a contrast. So you're creating a visual interest. And there is a fence going back here, but I might not bother too much to find that. There's a bit of wall I will pick up. I might indicate it, but I'm not too worried about painting everything exactly as it is. And then if you've got a bit of light green left on your brush, you've just been painting an area, well, and you don't need to wash your brush out. I don't tend to wash my brushes that much at the beginning anyway. You can always go back and use that green in another part of your subject. Look for where it is, look for where you see it, and you can add some lighter touches in other parts of the painting. So we're going to start working on the stonework next, on the house. One thing I'm going to change. I'm going to do one other thing first, and that is I'm going to take a smaller brush from my box here, and I'm going to just paint in while the sky is still sticky. Just a useful tip is how to paint some of these barer trees in the scene. So I'm mixing some burnt umber with a little bit of ochre and white, and in this instance I'm adding a tiny bit of water to my brush. So for example, if you're going to paint a tree trunk here, if you have a little bit of water in the brush, just for the first thin layer of a tree, you'll get a bit of flow to it, and you can move that brush. This is the brush with a tip on it, so it's a round brush with a thin tip. You can pick out some branch shapes like so, and it will flow better with that bit of moisture. If you use the paint too dry, it's very difficult to get it to flow along a branch, for example. So I placed one colour, and now I'm just going to go into that with a second darker colour here and there, because the tree is changing from light to dark and back again. And you need to find the different lights and darks in your tree to suggest that. There is a tree in front of the house here that I need to paint the wall before I can paint the tree. To paint some of the twiggery, as I call it, in the trees, in these spring trees. Let's see if I've got the right brush for this. It's good to use a hog brush, which has got a little bit of wear in it. So I've found a hog brush here, and because it's worn out a bit and splaying slightly, if I put just a little bit of paint on it and use it flat to the surface, I'm just going to make it slightly darker. This is very little paint. What I'm doing is, as I take it off the palette, I'm literally just wiping it round on the palette into the brush, so there's not much paint on the brush, and then you can just float the brush over the drying sky and do sort of side strokes of the brush, which will suggest all the twigs. And I'm changing the colour. I'm going to a slightly deeper shade now. All the twigs, without having to get out any tiny little brush to paint them all. And some of these twigs are a bit darker, some are a bit lighter. So very simple way to paint winter trees and or these spring trees using another sort of trick. Very thin, yeah. And there's trees behind the house here, and again now I can put them in just by And I tend to work from the outside of the tree in. So I'm going to the outside of the tree here, working into where the trunks are, and just flicking over the surface. The sky is pretty much dry now. If you make a mistake, you can get a damp cloth or tissue and just wipe it away, and then dry it again with tissue so you take off any residue, and then do it again. So don't worry if you get this wrong, but you can obviously practice it on a spare board or panel if you want before you paint on here. But because it's dry now, look at this, I can almost press the brush quite hard across the surface, and it will just suggest all these little twigs. I'll go in later and enhance those twigs with a few thinner branches, but it's quite a simple way to create this texture of these virtually bare trees with little buds coming. So you just, it's a trick. So that's on a few of the areas, and as I say, I can go in with a brush with a tip on it like I started with now, and or even a little detail brush. I can paint little wispy trunks and branches over the top of where I've just been working, and then you'll get the effect of the trees. And again, I've gone a bit heavily there, so I'm just going to break down those strokes with my bigger brush. I'll go back and put more detail into those, but I don't have to put every twig and every branch in individually. That's the trick of it. So let's start the stonework next. And this is where we can use the big flat brushes again. And if you start with yellow ochre, mix white into it, we want to get some sort of creamy colours. And yellow ochre, is actually a tertiary colour. Yellow ochre is really a mixture of red, yellow and blue already, but it's just got more yellow. And you'll see with a colour like this, we can paint virtually most of that chimney stack. Pale yellow ochre, white and yellow ochre. So you can just sort of pick out the highlights. And I'm painting sort of the wall more or less in one colour, but what I will do is go back into the wall, because it's a stone cottage. I'll go back into these walls with individual or different colours of stone ultimately, but just to start with, in the wall down here, this colour is a sort of base colour, if you like. In fact, I've got a little bit of blue in the brush down here, which is coming through from the sky, which is making it greyer. And if I add a little bit more of the ultramarine blue to the same colour, this side of the house has been rendered on top of the stone. So I'm going to paint it slightly greyer. And things like the window surrounds, which are paler, the stone, I will come back to and add in due course. So again, you paint the big shapes first. And using this big flat brush, I can get most of the shapes into place very easily. And the edges of the house here, they're paler, so I just add white, like so. I'm not painting white, I'm just adding a paler shade, like so and like so. And you'll notice now the sky's dried off, by the way. This is a pale creamy colour, but it's still paler than the colours I put in for the clouds. I didn't want to make the clouds too dominant, too bright and white. So let's get the edges of the building nice and sharp. And so I can use this same idea. The door frame and lintel are painted with, that brush is a bit too big actually, but never mind. If your brush is too big, there's a simple solution. You can start big like this and paint beyond where you want it. And then I take another brush with the first colour, which I've now got to recreate because I've run out. and you can trim that shape back. So you just enables you to use a large brush and paint a big area and then make little adjustments. So we're now sort of following the shapes through. And once you've got the base colour in, you can then make lots of different mixtures. So let's just do one at a time. So I'm just adding more yellow ochre to make some warmer colours on the stone side here and in the ruined wall here. And just pressing those colours in. I'm going to put some darks in a minute to make it more obvious. There are a few little tricks when it comes to doing. If you want to do all the individual stones and the dark lines between them, you could, no, I'm going to just use this colour to paint back the gatepost over here. You could paint every course with a nice little detail brush, but I'll show you a couple of ideas that might save you the sweat of doing that. So this is that gatepost over here. And if you want to make this colour greyer, I'll come back to doing that detail I'm talking about, but if you want to make the colour greyer, you can do the same as I did with the green. You just add a bit of blue and brown, so the ultramarine and the burnt umber.
Just going to the loo.
And you could just mix it into the other colours. And you can get greys, and you can get all the different shades you want just by varying the strength of the mixture. I'm putting a little bit more yellow back into it now, for example. So I can get my gatepost, we can get the grey wall down here. I'm not worrying too much at the moment about the sort of edges of all these parts of the subject, because I will sort of come back and reconnect those when I paint in the detail. I think the main thing I'm trying to show you here is that to paint anything complicated, don't get bogged down in the details too quickly, because if you do, you'll get frustrated. You might not find the painting is coming together like you want. It's much more satisfying to really block out the big shapes, the main forms of, you know, the walls of the house, the shapes of the trees and the lawn and all the rest of it, and then you can always come back and add as much detail as you enjoy painting when you've got those areas into position. So let's just start putting in some more darks. For instance, in the door here, I'm just going to put some burnt umber underneath there and down. Now there's a sort of browny red door I'll put in due course, but I'm just going to place these big shadows in this window too, in the little dormer window up here, not quite so dark, but and then if I add the ultramarine again to those, I can to the shadow colour, the brown, I can put in. And here I just need a little bit of moisture on that brush when I start picking up details, but I can pick up the shadows underneath the gutter here and underneath the overhang here, and in the dormer, and the colours at the top of the chimney. Just start to pick out all the different variations of colour. The top of the chimney, by the way, it's got a corbel, which is a prominent course of either bricks or mortar. So here's the corbeling, which is dark. It just throws a bit of a shadow, and that's picking up. And the first lines that I drew, remember, when we described this, was to get those angles following the perspective of the house. And if it goes in a bit too dark, like here, well, you just come back with a bit more colour, paler colour. I mean, I might find myself coming back and putting a little bit of sky around the chimney again to sharpen it up. Much better, just work quickly with these bigger brushes and then come back and tidy up later if required. So there's some darks in this arch here. So the left side of each part, the left side of the masonry here is in shadow. So let's put in a nice bit of brown and blue. Again, burnt umber, ultramarine. Stones underneath here are discoloured. The top of this one is darker. Just picking out little patches of light and dark. Underneath the greenery growing down the wall here, we've got some more shadows. So doing again little down brown patches. And I'm just coming back with some brighter green above, using the sap green and yellow ochre. So just to get some greens back in front here, because I don't see quite as much of that wall. And it's probably from here on, it's a process of just building up layers. So you're going backwards and forwards. You're putting colours on top of colours. So I painted more wall than I could see. So now I'm putting more green back over the top of that wall. I painted more green than I could see in some areas. And again, I'll put more stones back into the gaps. So you're going to and fro, building up the sections. And you may find yourself making adjustments and thinking, oh, your lawn's not bright enough, and putting another layer on. That's fine. Or that your fencing needs to be, picked up on and made sharp. What colour is the fence compared to the wall? And so what I'm going to do here is just start hinting at that, and also show you how to build up those details. So roof first, and then I'm going to go through some layers. So I'm just going to put some yellow ochre and the cadmium red together, adding a bit of burnt umber to brown it, so we've got a dark red, and this is going to just be a sort of base colour for the tiles. Nice, again, a square-ended flat brush means I can go in sharp where I need it. I'm going to change colour as I go around the edge of the hip, so I won't paint that all. I'll paint this side as well. And this is relatively thin layer of colour. I'll then put more yellow and white into it, produce some paler shades, just again hinting at the different colours in the tiles with little blocks of colour. It's the same process if you're painting a brick wall, is to sort of start with one colour and then build up lighter and darker shades for the different colours you see in the bricks. So I'm just picking up a little bit more light on this hip, the right side of this roof. So there's a little bit of difference between the two. And then it goes darker into the top of the dormer window. So we put that in too. So we're just starting to get this light dark. Now, the source photograph has got some very dark bits in it, but they're only little thin patches. So for example, the ridge tiles. So I'm just going to put in a few little darker lines here and there to indicate the courses of the tiles. And this is one of those things where you've got to paint about 1,372 tiles on that side of the roof. I'm not going to count them, but I am going to pick out the different colours I see. So you can pick them out in blocks, and if you keep going by overlapping little strokes on top of strokes on top of strokes, ultimately you will suggest lots of little tiles. You have to keep going with different shades. So for example, if I go back with a little bit lighter now on top of the darks, or a little bit brighter, you can use things like cadmium orange here, by the way, to really add a brighter layer. So that's what I've just mixed in here, just a little bit brighter colours. And that also picks up on the ground colour, which still shows through in a few places. And while I've got that orange, I see a few little colours here and there amongst the trees, different buds. Or
I've got no strength on my left-hand side. It's all sort of lopsided.
There we go. So that just adds a little bit more, and I'll come back and put more in there. You can use a bit more orange and yellow ochre now for doing the chimney pots. These sort of pinky terracotta colours, and again a flat brush. This is too big, so I've gone over my corbels. Do you see that? Dreadful. So now I just use the corner of the brush with a bit of burnt umber to do the little cowlings on top of the chimney pots, but I can go back and correct that where I went over the edge of the corbelling. So if you do accidentally go too far with any particular colour, you can go back and correct it with the original colour. So I'm now just painting this side of the chimney with some different shades. Just to try and show the weathering and the antiquity of the building. So it's generally a little bit lighter on the right than on the left. What I do need to do is distinguish between this old wall here, which is in front of the building entirely, but the way I'll do that is start building up more colours in the walls, and so I'm picking out sort of individual groupings of stones now with some slightly warmer shades of yellow here, whereas in this wall I'm going to pick out some greyer shades by adding and so for example, just with the corner of my flat brush, I tend to, with a brush like this, when you've got lots of paint, it changes shape, so you have to make sure when you get the brush it's in the right shape. It's a flat brush, I want it flat, and that means I can paint flat shapes, but sometimes when it's full of paint it distorts it, so just reshape the brush on the palette. I can now paint some little rectangular shapes in the wall, and what you're doing when you paint a wall like this is you're having to follow again the angles of the perspective, so you keep checking, you follow the drawing you started with to get the right shapes, but as we get the colours built in, what we do is we reduce the size of the brush, so now we can go down to smaller. This is actually quite a worn out little flat brush, but this is perfect for doing individual stones, which you can do just with single strokes, and then you can pick out more and more stones in the wall with very small sweeps of the brush. So it's again layering up and building more and more into it. And I can also use this little brush to sort of add a bit of texture or discoloration. So the wall, so just mixing variations on the colours you've already placed. You know, slightly cooler shades by adding more bluey colours, or slightly warmer shades by adding more orangey colours. And the more you do, the more you'll exploit the textures within. So I was going to talk about individual stones. Now you could get a little detail brush, and I'll show you how, and do some fine work. Okay. So this is where you wet the brush and use the colour more like watercolour. So you can use a brush like this, which you can also use for painting twigs and branches because it's nice and thin, like so. But if you keep adding water to the brush, keep it thin, you can go along your wall and add some nice thin shadowy lines, picking out stones and the shadows between the stones. And because it's a rough stone wall, these aren't straight lines, they're sort of slightly wonky. They go thick, they go thin, they're changing all the time. So you can do a bit of that, and that's very satisfying, and you can while away the hours. But there's another quick method I'll show you in a second that you might consider. So you can do a bit of that. I'll do a bit more here to show you how you can vary it, and then going back here I will do it with a really thin brush, with the brush again, much more water. For the thinner the line, the more the water you use. And in fact there's more than one method I can do this with. I could just show you a few. And then you can choose what you work. You can do this for tiling as well, put in the shadows between the tiles. And you can use it for the highlights of the paler tiles. So just as an example, I'm just doing that. Just going to get some paler paler pinky colours on the brush. So for example on the roof here I can pick out the very small changes in colour. I can also pick out the little hip tiles here which catch the light differently. The ridge of the here, there are lots of, so you can keep on adding detail. If you've got a good brush with a good tip to it, you can pick that out. In fact, the edge of this chimney, there's another case in hand. I lost the edge, so you can just use a nice sharp detail brush, put that back. Slightly misaligned, let's get that in there. So you can do that, but there's a couple of other methods. So you can use your original charcoal pencil, which is a very neat way of drawing back into your paint. And charcoal, remember, will mix with the paint. So if you've got a charcoal pencil, that's a good way to add to the texture and the detail. That's one method. It's a bit blunt at the minute. You can do it with a pencil, but that will stand out. The pencil, the graphite in the pencil will make it shine a bit. Sorry, moving my easel, getting it stable. You can also draw back into other areas if you want to pick out, you know, the detail of a door or whatever else. It's very easy to blend that charcoal into your painting by putting a very thin wash. I've just got some burnt umber and ultramarine again, very diluted like watercolour. So though I was painting it initially, this is so diluted on its own it probably barely show up. But I can follow some of these charcoal lines, put them in very easily, and just working through the courses of the stones, perhaps doing the horizontal lines first and doing the little vertical divisions bit by bit. And you can pick out a few of the stones, by the way, in different shades in between those lines. But another tool that helps you get these sort of details is to use a nib, or you can use the palette knife, or even, as in here, I've got a bit of credit card, and I've cut the credit card diagonally, so I've got a thinner end to it, and you can place little lines and little smudges with the end of the card, and that also produces the suggestion of detail with actually very limited amount of work. So you can build up textures, you can work into the colours. You can also apply the paint in little blocks of colour. So I've got it just on the end here, and obviously if I cut the card to an even finer point I could do that. You can obviously use your palette knife, but sometimes the advantage of the credit card is you can cut it to the shape you need to do the job that you want. So you can start to build up all the different shapes in your landscape, your buildings. You can also use the thinner bits to put in, you know, fencing posts. So for example, with our bits of fence now, I'm using the other side of this, and I'm mixing up a grey using the brown and the blue, this time with a bit more blue, so it's a bluey grey, and then I can do this. Placing, oh, I haven't quite got the paint thick enough, let's get it thicker, not quite. So you've got thicker paint on the brush, and you can do this. And just place your posts, and you can do your crossbars the same way. And it's a simpler way. It also, one, it's simpler, but it also means you can get the sort of slightly irregular shapes here just by moving the credit card up and down. For those of you who don't want to cut up your credit card, I mean, it's a win-win situation as far as I can see. You can use your palette knife, but just remember, palette knives, you've got to get one short enough. So this palette knife's a bit long for the height of those posts, but it's not too long for the width of the timbers going across. So I can use the edge of the blade. You need to get the paint so it's even along the edge of the blade, and that might take a little bit of practice, just mixing it on the palette, getting it even, sometimes shaping it on the blade with another blade or with your card, even your fingers, and then you can place shapes like this. It just means you can work quite quickly. You can do quite thin shapes. And if they don't quite all connect up, well, you can always go in with a detail brush and then add to it. But remember that all these things, like fences and so on, especially an old one, they'll change in colour. They're not a consistent colour. So I place the first colour, and then I can go back with a detail brush again and add to it. So I'm just going to clean off my detail brush. So I'm now just again mixing up a diluted grey with the blue and the brown, but less white in it. So now I can go along beside these posts and draw little shadows underneath them and add to the paint. And because the credit card left some quite thick paint, by using thin paint now, it picks up some of the thick paint as you go, so you get different shades. It produces a nice sort of random texture, and you get the advantage of the dark and the light working together. And all these stakes have got dark shadows underneath them, so I'm just following my lines along with the brush. And again, I could follow the lines with the credit card. I could do it with, you know, different brushes, different knives, but it's always worth practicing the different ways of working with the tools you've got, so that you can respond to all the subject matters you ever want to paint in a variety of ways. So you can start to pick out a lot of detail here. This post is a bit chunky, so what I'm going to do is mix up some green and paint back. So I'm just getting a sap green and yellow. Using my trusty painting rag so I can get the brush clean enough.
Your orange background looks like sunlight coming through.
Well, it does. I'll probably lose a bit of it, a bit more, but I will leave bits of it, because it seems to me that it's actually the sort of thing you can see. So here, for example, I can make my darker green for that post and just take a little bit off it by painting up to it, making that a bit thinner, perhaps making it a little bit shorter. And the same with any other post. So if you think, as I say, if you overpaint an area or you get something you don't expect, don't worry. You can go back, you can correct it later. It's all about getting the thing looking right. But it doesn't matter if you get a spot of paint in the wrong place, because you can just, if you can't get it off, just cover it up. So just create some more shadows. If you put too much water on the paint when you're trying to paint bigger areas, you tend to get flatter bits of colour. So that's why I say I'm just using my watery paint for these detail areas. And if your paint is dragging too much, put a bit of moisture in the brush, but don't overdo it. You don't want dripping paint on top of the thick paint. Probably you don't want that. What I'm going to do is just start to move through some of the areas. For example, this dormer window here isn't standing out enough, so I'm just going to put some other colours in the tiles around it. I might add some more details to those. I'm going to come in a minute and just put, I've got some yellow ochre and white, going back to my very first colour that I painted the walls with. So I want to open up this triangle here a little bit. I'm just using the corner of the brush to do that, to make that a bit more of a feature. Of course, I've got to put the tree in front of it all, but you don't want to do that until you've got everything pretty much sorted in the foreground. This part of the chimney needs some more light on it, coming down here. So when you're painting architecture, even rustic architecture of this type, you need good edges on your brushes. You need flat brushes. So square flat brushes are the perfect tool to get your architectural shapes looking detailed and accurate. If you're painting natural forms, then rounded brushes, filberts, are more sympathetic. So it's having the right tool for the job. And if you're painting a wonky old house like this, you need a bit of patience, but the advantage of a wonky old house is that if it's a bit wonky, your perspective, if it isn't perfect, it probably won't matter. Well, it won't matter so much, as long as you get your chimney pots right. So I can now go in with my little flat brush and put in different lines like this. I'm just using the edge of the brush to suggest lines. And again, once I've done the lines, I'll go back and put more stones on top of those lines. So you, bit by bit, they'll start to look like real stones. So down in this wall where I put in some lines earlier, I now mix another shade of ochre, and some of those stones I pick out with a slightly different colour. You can just dot around and look for the colours that you see. I mean, some of the ones up here have got more orange in, some of the ones lower down have got more grey in them, and of course we haven't painted the leaves of all the flowers growing in here and on top of it, but again, you need to get most of your stonework right first. I've now got mixing a bit more blue and grey into here, picking out some stones. If you've got bright sunlight, you often need very bright light colours to pick out your effects. So look and see, if you're getting some very bright contrasts. Another tool you can use when you're painting texture is the back end of a brush. Sometimes you put the paint on and it just goes wonky, so I'm just turned around the other end of the brush and I scrape it back like this, just scratching back into the paint and moving it around a bit. So, if you think your lines are too prominent, well, you can scratch back and roughen up the surface, especially if it's hasn't dried yet. Best way is to go back and just manoeuvre it. And you can see this little section of wall starting to look more convincing than that, which is a bit too sharp. So you can rework the paint with the other end of the brush, and occasionally I even sharpen up a brush like this with just a plain wooden handle. You can use a pencil sharpener, and then you've got a nice tool to manipulate the paint with. So I could do lots more of that, but I'll show you. I'll do some of the greenery down below next. These leaves, tulip leaves, daffodil leaves, iris leaves, they're always a very bluey shade of green, so you need to use your cerulean blue and yellow ochre for the lightest shades, and you can use, for the deeper greens, you can use the you can use the cerulean blue, but with less white, basically. So we're going to mix another shade of green with cerulean blue, less white, and just a bit of yellow. And I'm going to try and suggest all of these with a more loose approach. So I'm going back to one of my filbert brushes, and we can just go down to the bottom of the wall and flick upwards to get some vertical bits of colour. And I'm using thick colour now. It's not any water on the brush. This is just thick colour again, going over the top with this sort of bluey green shade. There are some shadows down there at the base, so I'm going to add my shadowy brown blue mixture as earlier and just go down underneath them and just put in a few little darks and flick them up into the greens. That's a bit too blue actually, these, but don't worry, I shall be over layering the colours. So put in a shadowy base, a few shadows in the middle of them as well, a few more shadows in this bush, but I've got the colour there. And then we can go back to the brighter colours on top. So I've placed dark and light, but then you need to go in with so that's with the filbert. So now I can go back to a flat brush and actually put individual leaves in over the top. I'm adding a little bit more yellow. So once you've got the main colours in, it's like painting the bushes. You can put the main colours in and then put the darks, lights back over the top. Try and suggest all the different colours you're seeing in the flowers. So this is a bit raw at the minute. Probably take a little bit more work. So even a line of flower leaves like this takes a bit of time. But use the paint nice and thick and layer up the different colours. And occasionally, if you're painting individual flowers, you'll need to pick out some details. For instance, there's a couple of the leaves are flopping over, catching the light. So down here, let's do that. So you can just do a little one or two of them doing this, falling over, and over here they're flopping right over and coming back again. So you just pick out a few of these other shapes amongst them. And if you go a bit too far like that, you can just go back and thin those strokes down with the first colours we were using. So I'm just going to see if I can do it with the edge of the brush like that. Maybe I should have used a thinner brush in the first instance, but what I'm trying to do is paint this in without too much, fuss and little brush. So as much as possible, I'm using the bigger brushes, but if it doesn't quite work, you can always get a smaller brush in a minute and sort it out. So let's just show you a few more techniques in the foliage as you build it up. So I'm mixing up a middle green using yellow ochre and a bit of sap green now. And I'm going to do a bit of this. It's what I call roly-poly. You just get the brush and you just twist it and roll it over the surface. And then you get another shade, and it could be a darker shade. And you can do this with different types of brushes, like so. And you roll different shades into each other. And wherever you've got these big sort of rounded shapes in shrubs or trees, you can do it. That's with actually probably the wrong brush. That's my architectural brush. Let's do it with a filbert to show you the difference. But experiment, because different brushes will produce different effects. Different plants will require more. So let's do it now with my big filbert. And again, there's no water, there's no added water to this paint. It's just sticky paint. So here we go, roly-poly like this. You can roll it over the edge of the sky. So that's in one shade. Let's go a bit darker. So I'm adding some brown and blue. And it gives you very naturalistic patterns. And you can vary the pressure, you can change brushes. You've got the overhang of the ivy here. It starts to create form within the shapes, but without being too structured. It's a sort of naturalistic approach to it. You can also, when you've got the paint sticky like this, just do little, I'm looking at the ivy here, just little patches, just stippling with the brush. But as you stipple, rather than just stippling always in the same way, you can stipple with the tip, you can stipple with the edge, you can stipple with the side, and just see what movement of the brush produces the best patterns. And for those of you who are trying to do things like this with watercolour, you can actually do very similar things, especially into a damp surface. You can literally flick and roll soft Chinese brushes, just rolling the colour on top of a damp surface, or when it's dry, again, you'll get a sharper effect. But it's just about experimenting what the brush can do for you, rather than trying to sort of over-control it all. So it produces a more naturalistic look. I'm just going to put some more cadmium yellow onto my palette. This one. To put in some slightly brighter greens again. run out of yellow. If you do have to rinse your brush, clean it, I'm just taking out any excess moisture with my rag, or you can do it with your kitchen roll or similar. And the idea now is to go back to the lights and do the same thing on top. So if it comes up too much dark, you can do a bit of roly-poly on top of the darks. And rather than paint about 7,000 leaves, you've done, half a dozen layers sort of tumbling across each other like this. It's very much more effective. You can bring in a bit more bright yellow or add individual flowers. The same back here, just come in with some slightly brighter colours through here. And we can do the same for the blossoms. So let's just clean the brush up. Over here we needed some blossom. It's not white, it's sort of creamy coloured, so I'm adding a tiny bit of red and yellow ochre that is, and cadmium red. And I'm going to start with, well actually there's a hint of pink in the middle one, that's called cherry blossom, so I'm going to start with slightly pink and then I'm going to go slightly yellowy. And again, by using, and before I paint the tree, I can use the side of this brush. Bit thick there, don't worry. Just taking it off on the rag. We're going to paint into this in a minute. And over here we want to do it slightly whiter. And I'm just pushing the brush into the palette to control the amount of paint that's on the end. The last one was a bit solid, that's more like it. And again, just by using the edge of the brush or just turning the brush, you can get all the bits of blossom. I'm taking the excess paint off the brush now, just to break it down a bit more. There's a bit more blossom in the distance through here. And it changes colour. So I'm going to break this one up by putting some darker colours into the middle of it. So you can start with light and then you can put other colours between and overpaint it. So if the blobs come out too solid, like these ones did a bit, I can go back into the middle with the original colours. There's some darks here. Again, just breaking it down. So you build up paint upon paint, layer upon layer, and you can get the whole effect without being too pedantic. And the same in here, there's some darks. I can just break up those bigger pink blobs with some darker strokes. And don't forget that I'm going to be putting twigs between these as well. So I indicated a few twigs to start with. I indicate some more layers like this. And if it comes up a bit too solid, where there are clumps of twigs that are grouping together, maybe that I should come down a size in brush. But you can always, when you get too solid a lump like there, I can go back into my colours. Here, just use a detail brush and just put some brighter blossoms on top. So you can build up broken strokes with quite thick paint. We've done the very scumbly strokes with very meagre amounts of paint. Just paint another shade into the middle of that lump and you'll get the thing starting to work. So now we can go back to the technique of watering down the paint a bit and starting to paint this tree like so, which comes up right in front of the house. And by painting from the trunk upwards, you can do the thicker bits and then go thinner and thinner. And when you come up into the foliage, you're weaving, you're placing, you're not doing continuous lines, you're just connecting up the blossoms with some thin lines. like this. So you just start by reaching blossom, then you stop, then you let the blossom show, and then you paint through the blossom, and then you carry on to the next bit. And if you keep doing a few more twigs like this, you do have to paint a bit of detail to get this effect, but it does require a little bit of patience. But hopefully, because you've built up so much of the tree using these scumbling techniques and stippling techniques, the amount of detail required is far less than if you try to paint it twig by twig and leaf by leaf and petal by petal. So it's about getting an effect. So there I've probably gone a bit of a splodge with my branch, so I clean the brush, I go back to my pinky blossoms or whitey blossoms here, and I can just literally overpaint those. I've actually brought the blossom on a tiny bit from the photograph, but I hope you'll forgive me for that. In a couple of
see the blossom, no centre one.
This one, yeah, you see it's just up against the sky. Yes, in the photograph you don't, but it's coming up, and I bet you if you walk up there now, there'll be more of it today than there was yesterday, and so on. So, and of course the tree goes right on up to here, so I can now sort of stipple in the smaller blossoms just with the tip of the brush, and I can stipple in the little darker buds again with the tip of the brush. Oh, it's a bit too solid. Take some paint off the brush, keep going. And you're getting an effect. It's quite a subtle effect, but you can see how you're getting the idea of the tree is not hiding the house. And just like in the photograph, bits of the roof are now showing through the tree. And of course you can put more twigs in and carry on, but I'm not going to bore you with all that detail. I'm just trying to show you a way to proceed, and then it's up to you as to whether you want to paint more and more. I mean, this tree here, for example, there's much more dark in it, so having got it indicated with the lighter colours, I'm not going to paint it all dark. I'm just going to connect up some of these lighter patches with some more shadowy colours, and then add a few more branches. I'm actually following the lines that I can see, so it's not a copy of the tree, but it's hopefully indicating the characteristics of the tree, and that's really more important, because if you copy it, I don't think it will ever have as much interest to look at as a painting. So the ways that the branches are sort of growing round and swirling round each other, I could carry on doing a lot more of that too, but and really from this stage on, it is just about how much detail you want to indicate, whether it's in the stonework, whether it's in the foliage, whether it's in the the chimneys or the roof and so on. And is it light or dark enough? Maybe that roof could be lightened up in a few areas. That's the sort of decision. All of us will make a different decision on it. There's no right answer. It's really what effect you want to give. So I'm just mixing up a lighter, brighter tile colour now, because some of these tiles here are really catching the light, so I'm going to sort of add it. And again, detail brush, just add a few more tiles. You've only got to add half a dozen tiles here and there, and the whole roof will look like it's got 1,000 tiles on it. So it's a little bit of suggestion, the power of persuasion and suggestion to indicate what you want. But it's at this stage still very much an impression. And you could bring the flowers forward if you wanted to. I could put in more individual leaves if I wanted to. They probably should come up higher. But I hope really from what I've shown you so far, you would be able to, I'm going to just correct this area here. I hope you would be able to develop this scene in a way that would suit you. Let's just grab another brush, grab a bit of green. So my cadmium green I just put on the palette, and some sap, and I can come in here, and where I made a mistake I can easily cover it. And I can also add more groupings of leaves in a few key areas, and I can add a few more shadows. So what I will do, but from this stage onwards I would probably spend another hour just literally adding a few details here, and they're picking out the more more stones more carefully. These stones are still a bit crude, and I'd like to indicate the surfaces with a little bit more care in areas, but that will take a bit more detail to achieve, and also just produced a different variety in the texture. So this area is starting to work. It could have a little bit more light on it. Again, a lighter green, just show you with a few strokes. That's a bit too, hang on, a bit too white, put more yellow in it. So it's just stippling in a few highlights here and there. So having done all that roly-poly, you just pick out, there's an area there where the shrubs are catching the sun. Maybe down here, maybe on top of the wall. We've got ivy overgrowing it. So it's very easy to go in now and pick out the features that you want with smaller brushes if need be, or with added layers of colour. I think otherwise, and I've got to add sort of daisies. How are you going to add daisies? Well, you can either get the tiddly little brush and add them, or you could try splattering, a bit dangerous, or you could try scumbling, but that'd be quite tricky to get the effect of individual flowers. So I think the answer there is, if you want them all in, you may just have to paint them all in. There we are, I've done a few for you, but they're not necessarily white. They might be slightly different shades. So again, some white, some slightly pink, some slightly grey, some slightly yellow, etc. See if you can indicate them. There are groupings of them where you can probably just put some bigger strokes down, but you'll have to put in a lot more detail. So there are some areas where the detail brush is required. Otherwise, I think it's down to you. Thank you very much.